I found the threatening letter wedged between my front door and the frame on a Tuesday morning, printed on what looked like official Pinehurst Meadows HOA letterhead, demanding I remove my allegedly unauthorized fence within 72 hours or face a $10,000 fine and immediate legal action. The problem was, I didn't have a fence, had never installed a fence, and according to my property survey, there wasn't even a fence on my lot line that could be causing confusion. My name is Patrick Lancaster, and I'm an environmental consultant who moved to this suburban Phoenix neighborhood 8 months ago, expecting quiet Arizona sunsets and maybe the occasional dispute about lawn maintenance, not whatever insanity this letter represented. The letterhead looked professional enough at first glance, complete with the HOA logo, official address, and what appeared to be the signature of the HOA president. But something felt wrong about the whole thing. The tone was aggressive beyond reason, threatening legal action without any prior warning or discussion. I'd received exactly 2 communications from the actual HOA since moving in, a welcome packet and a reminder about trash collection schedules. Nothing about fences, nothing about violations, nothing that would warrant this nuclear option of a letter. I called the HOA office number listed on my original welcome packet, and a pleasant woman named Gloria answered on the 3rd ring. Pinehurst Meadows HOA, how can I help you? Hi, this is Patrick Lancaster from 4782 Seguero Lane. I just received a letter about a fence violation, and I'm confused because I don't have a fence. There was a pause on the other end. I'm sorry, Mr. Lancaster, but I don't show any violations filed for your address. Can you tell me more about this letter? I read the letter's contents to her, and I heard her typing on a keyboard in the background. That's very strange, Gloria said, her voice taking on a concerned edge. That's not our current letterhead format, and we would never issue a violation notice without at least 2 prior warnings and a board meeting discussion. Also, the signature on that letter, you said it's from Margaret Hensley. Yes, that's what it says. Mr. Lancaster, Margaret Hensley hasn't been HOA president for 3 years. Our current president is David Chung, and Margaret moved out of state about 18 months ago. Someone is sending you fake HOA correspondence. My stomach dropped. Are you serious? Unfortunately, yes. I'd recommend you keep that letter and document everything. This isn't the first complaint we've received about unusual correspondence in the past few weeks, but this is the first actual letter someone's brought to our attention. Would you be able to bring it by the office so we can examine it? I told her I'd be there within the hour. After hanging up, I examined the letter more carefully under my kitchen's bright LED lights. The paper quality was decent, the printing crisp, but now that I knew it was fake, I could see the subtle differences. The logo was slightly off-center, and the font wasn't quite right. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create a convincing forgery, but why? The HOA office was located in a small strip mall about 2 miles from my house, nestled between a yoga studio and a tax preparation service. Gloria turned out to be a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She examined my letter with a practiced eye, then shook her head. "This is sophisticated," she said. "Someone really put effort into this forgery. Do you mind if I make copies? Please do." "Do you have any idea who might be doing this?" Gloria hesitated, glancing toward a closed door at the back of the office. "I shouldn't speculate, but there's been some drama in the neighborhood lately. A few residents have been upset about various board decisions, and there's been some, let's call it creative interpretation of the rules by certain individuals." Before I could ask what she meant, the back door opened and a woman in her mid-40s emerged, carrying a stack of file folders. She had the severe haircut and determined expression of someone who'd asked to speak to many managers in her lifetime. Her eyes immediately locked onto the letter in Gloria's hands. "What's that?" she demanded. "Carol, this is Mr. Lancaster from Sagaro Lane. He received a fraudulent HOA letter threatening him with fines." Carol Hendricks, as her name tag identified her, snatched the letter from Gloria's hands before I could object. Her face went through several expressions as she read it: surprise, anger, then something that looked almost like satisfaction. "This is outrageous," she declared. "We need to find out who's doing this immediately." "I'm more interested in why someone would send fake HOA letters," I said. "What's the point?" Carol's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Lancaster, some people in this neighborhood have no respect for rules and regulations. They think they can do whatever they want with their properties, and when the HOA tries to maintain standards, they resort to harassment and defamation." Something about her tone put me on edge. "But I haven't done anything wrong. I don't even have a fence." "Obviously," Carol said dismissively. "This is clearly someone trying to discredit the HOA's legitimate enforcement actions. We've been cracking down on violations lately, and apparently some residents don't appreciate it." Gloria interjected. "Carol, we should report this to the board and possibly the police. Impersonating an organization's official communications could be a crime." "I'll handle it," Carol said sharply. "I'm the vice president, after all. Mr. Lancaster, we'll investigate this matter and get back to you. In the meantime, ignore any further letters that don't come directly from this office." I left the HOA office feeling more confused than when I'd arrived. Something about Carol's reaction seemed off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I decided to do some research on my own, starting with my neighbors. My next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who'd lived in Pinehurst Meadows for 15 years, was working in his garage when I got home. I walked over with the letter and asked if he'd received anything similar. Frank wiped his hands on a rag and examined the letter. "Haven't gotten one of these, but I'm not surprised someone's playing games. You know Carol Hendricks, the woman who works at the HOA office. Just met her. She's been a piece of work lately. Ever since she got elected vice president last year, she's been on a power trip. Started writing up violations for the smallest things. Trash cans left out 15 minutes too long, flowers that are supposedly the wrong color according to some obscure clause in the CC and Hendricks. You name it. People are getting fed up. You think someone's sending fake letters to make her look bad?" Frank scratched his chin. "Maybe. Or maybe Carol's sending them herself to justify some kind of crackdown. I wouldn't put it past her. She tried to fine me $500 last month because my garage door was open past 8 p.m. Said it was an eyesore that violated neighborhood standards." I was literally just finishing up a woodworking project. I thanked Frank for the information and spent the rest of the afternoon digging through the Pinehurst Meadows HOA documents I'd received when I bought the house. The CC and Hendricks were extensive, covering everything from acceptable house paint colors to the exact height requirements for hedges. Some of the rules seemed reasonable, but others were bizarrely specific and borderline unenforceable. 3 days later, I received a second letter. This one was even more threatening than the first, claiming I'd failed to respond to the initial violation notice, and that legal proceedings would begin immediately. It included a demand for $15,000 in fines and attorney's fees, payable within 5 business days. I immediately called Gloria at the HOA office, but this time she sounded genuinely frightened. "Mr. Lancaster, you're the 3rd person to call today about these fake letters, and they're all escalating in terms of the threats and dollar amounts. One of them even claimed we were placing a lien on someone's property. Has the board done anything about this? We're meeting tomorrow night. Emergency session. David Chung, our president, is taking this very seriously. He's talking about involving the police. Good. Because this is getting out of hand. Have you noticed any pattern in who's receiving these letters? Gloria lowered her voice. Actually, yes. All of the recipients have had disputes with Carol Hendricks in the past 6 months. She wrote violations against every single one of you. The pieces started falling into place in my mind. Wait, she wrote a violation against me. I never received anything official. According to our records, yes, about 3 weeks ago. She claimed your landscaping was non-compliant because you have decorative rocks instead of grass in your front yard. But the board rejected the violation because decorative xeriscaping is explicitly allowed under our rules. We even sent her a memo about it. I thought back to my front yard's desert landscaping. Native plants, red volcanic rock, and a beautiful ocotillo that bloomed in the spring. It was water efficient and perfectly suited to Arizona's climate. So Carol tried to fine me. The board said no, and now I'm getting fake letters. I'm not saying Carol is behind this, Gloria said quickly, but the timing is suspicious. The emergency board meeting the next night was held at the community center, a modest building near the neighborhood's main entrance. About 30 residents showed up, many clutching the same type of threatening letters I'd received. The energy in the room was tense and angry. David Chung, the HOA president, was a calm Asian American man in his 50s who worked as an accountant. He called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. I want to assure everyone that these letters are not coming from the official HOA board. We have never authorized communication of this nature, and we take this fraud very seriously. A woman in the back stood up. Then where are they coming from? Because they look damn official and they're scaring people. My elderly mother received one threatening to foreclose on her house. She's been having panic attacks. Carol Hendricks stood up from her seat on the board panel. I think we all know what's happening here. Someone with a grudge against the HOA is trying to create chaos and undermine our authority. We need to find this person and prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. Funny how all the victims happen to be people you've written violations against. Someone muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Carol's face flushed red. Are you accusing me of something? David held up his hands. Let's keep this civil. Carol, several board members have noticed the pattern. All of the fake letter recipients have been involved in disputes with you specifically. Can you think of any reason why someone might be targeting these particular residents? Because they're all rule breakers, Carol snapped. They've all violated HOA regulations, and when I tried to enforce those rules, the board wouldn't back me up. Maybe this is karma. The room erupted in angry voices. I stood up and David recognized me. Mr. Lancaster. I want to know why Carol wrote a violation against my xeriscaping when it's explicitly allowed in the CC and Articus. I also want to know why I never received official notice of this violation. Carol glared at me. Your rock garden is an eyesore. Just because the technical wording of the rules allows it doesn't mean it meets the spirit of our community standards. The spirit? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The CC and Articus specifically encourage water-efficient landscaping. That's not interpretation. That's literally what the document says. David intervened. Carol, we've discussed this. You can't enforce rules that don't exist based on your personal preferences. That's not how HOAs work. Well, maybe it should be, Carol shot back. I'm trying to maintain property values while the rest of you let the neighborhood go to hell. Another board member, a soft-spoken woman named Jennifer, spoke up. Carol, I think you need to take a step back from enforcement duties until we figure out what's going on with these letters. The conflict of interest is too apparent. Conflict of interest. I'm the only one on this board who actually cares about standards. The meeting devolved into arguments for another 30 minutes before David finally managed to restore order. He announced that the board would be hiring an attorney to investigate the fake letters, and that they'd be filing a police report. He also placed Carol on temporary administrative leave from any enforcement activities, which she protested loudly but ultimately couldn't overrule. As people filed out of the meeting, I noticed Carol having a heated conversation with another woman I didn't recognize. The stranger was younger, maybe early 30s, dressed in a business suit and looked distinctly uncomfortable. I edged closer, pretending to check my phone. "I told you to be more subtle," the stranger was saying in a low voice. "This is getting out of control." "They're not taking me seriously," Carol hissed. "I needed to show them what happens when rules aren't enforced. By impersonating a law firm, do you have any idea how illegal that is?" My blood ran cold. I pulled out my phone and actually started recording, holding it casually at my side. Carol and the stranger moved toward the parking lot, and I followed at a distance. "The letters aren't from a law firm," Carol said. "They're from the HOA. I'm part of the HOA, therefore I have the authority." "That's not how this works, Carol. I'm an attorney, and I'm telling you that what you're doing constitutes fraud, harassment, and possibly extortion. You need to stop immediately. You said you'd help me clean up this neighborhood." I said I'd provide legal advice on legitimate enforcement actions. I never agreed to this insanity. Those letters you created with my firm's letterhead. That's forgery and unauthorized practice of law. If anyone reports this to the State Bar Association, I could lose my license. I nearly dropped my phone. So Carol had created the letters, but she'd also forged letterhead from a law firm. This was bigger than I'd thought. The attorney, whose name I still didn't know, continued. "I'm done. I want nothing more to do with this. And if you're smart, you'll stop sending those letters immediately and hope no one decides to press charges." "You can't abandon me now," Carol pleaded, her authoritative tone cracking. "I've already sent out another round. They're going out in tomorrow's mail." The attorney's face went pale in the parking lot lights. "You what, Carol, that's it. I'm reporting this myself before it comes back on me. I have an ethical obligation. You wouldn't dare. I'll tell everyone you helped me plan this. I have emails proving otherwise." All I did was answer general questions about HOA enforcement. I never authorized the use of my firm's name, and I specifically told you multiple times that your interpretation of the rules was incorrect. The attorney got into her car and drove off, leaving Carol standing alone in the parking lot. I debated confronting her right then, but decided it was better to take what I'd learned to the police and the HOA board. The next morning, I went straight to the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office substation and asked to file a report. The deputy who took my statement, a young guy named Rodriguez, listened to my story with growing interest. "So you recorded this conversation?" he asked. "Yes, I have it on my phone. Carol Hendricks admitted to creating the fake letters and to using a law firm's letterhead without authorization." Deputy Rodriguez called over his supervisor, a sergeant named Williams, who listened to the recording twice. "This is definitely criminal," Williams said. "Forgery, fraud, possibly criminal impersonation. And if she's threatening property liens and legal action, we might be looking at extortion as well." "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll open an investigation. I'd recommend you contact the attorney mentioned in this recording and let her know she should cooperate with us. If she's willing to testify that her firm's letterhead was used without permission, that strengthens the forgery case significantly." I left the sheriff's office and called David Chung. He was shocked by the recording and immediately convened another emergency board meeting for that evening. He also called an attorney himself to figure out the HOA's potential liability in all of this. The attorney Carol had been arguing with turned out to be Wendy Nelson, a partner at Nelson and Associates, a small firm in Scottsdale specializing in real estate law. I found her office number online and called, explaining who I was and what I'd witnessed. Wendy agreed to meet me for coffee that afternoon. She looked exhausted when she arrived at the Starbucks near her office, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone whose day had gone terribly wrong. "I've been practicing law for 8 years," she said after ordering a large coffee. "I've never had a client go completely off the rails like this." "So Carol was your client, in a very limited capacity. She came to me about 6 months ago asking questions about HOA enforcement procedures. I gave her general advice about following the CC and Articus, proper notice requirements, board approval processes, that sort of thing. All completely above board legal consultation. When did things go wrong?" Wendy rubbed her temples. "About 2 months ago, she started asking increasingly strange questions. Could the HOA impose fines without board approval? Could she personally enforce rules if she felt the board wasn't acting quickly enough? I told her repeatedly that the answer was no, that HOAs have to follow specific procedures, and that individual board members don't have unilateral authority. But she didn't listen. Clearly not. Then last week, one of my colleagues got a call from a resident in Pinehurst Meadows asking why our firm was threatening to foreclose on his house. We had no idea what he was talking about. When he described the letter, I immediately thought of Carol. I called her, and she admitted she'd been sending motivational enforcement letters to push the board to take action. Using your firm's letterhead. Wendy's jaw tightened, without my knowledge or permission. She somehow got hold of our letterhead template, probably from one of the documents I'd sent her during our consultation. I explicitly told her last week to stop, that what she was doing was illegal, but apparently she didn't care. The police are investigating now. They're going to want to talk to you. I know. I'm actually on my way to file a bar association complaint and cooperate fully with law enforcement. What Carol did could seriously damage my reputation and my firm. I won't let that slide. That evening's emergency board meeting was even more packed than the previous nights. Word had spread through the neighborhood about Carol's involvement, and people were furious. Carol herself didn't show up, which was probably wise given the mood in the room. David addressed the crowd with Gloria taking notes beside him. As of this afternoon, Carol Hendricks has been removed from the HOA board effective immediately. We've also filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office and are cooperating fully with the sheriff's investigation. What about all the fake violations she wrote? Someone called out. I got fined $300 for having the wrong mailbox color. David consulted with the HOA attorney, a distinguished older man named Richard Pemberton. We're reviewing all violations issued by Mrs. Hendricks over the past 6 months, Pemberton said. Any fines collected will be refunded, and any violations still pending will be dismissed. We're also conducting a comprehensive audit to ensure all current and future enforcement actions comply with your CC and Articus. Can we sue her? Another resident asked. Individually, yes, you could pursue civil claims, Pemberton replied. The HOA itself will also be considering legal action to recover costs associated with this incident and to protect the association's reputation. I raised my hand. What about the fake letters? Are people still receiving them? Gloria answered. We've been monitoring this closely. As of this morning, We've intercepted at least 15 more fraudulent letters that were dropped off at various mailboxes in the neighborhood. Carol apparently did a mass mailing yesterday before the attorney she'd been working with cut ties. The room erupted in angry muttering. David held up his hands. The sheriff's office is treating this as an active criminal investigation. We've been asked not to discuss specific details that might compromise their case, but I can tell you they're taking it very seriously. Over the next week, the situation escalated rapidly. The local news picked up the story after one of the residents tipped off a reporter. Suddenly, Pinehurst Meadows was getting unwanted attention as the neighborhood with the rogue HOA board member who'd been sending fake legal threats. Wendy Nelson filed her complaint with the State Bar of Arizona, alleging unauthorized use of her firm's name and letterhead. The Bar Association took it seriously, because even though Wendy wasn't the one who'd sent the letters, there was a risk that people might believe a licensed attorney had been involved in the fraud scheme. I got a call from Detective Sarah Chen, who'd been assigned to the case. She asked me to come down to the station to provide a formal statement and hand over my recording. When I arrived, she had me walk through everything that had happened, from the first fake letter to the parking lot conversation. We executed a search warrant on Mrs. Hendricks' home this morning, Detective Chen told me. We found extensive evidence, copies of the fake letters, the design files she used to create the forged letterheads, even a spreadsheet listing all the residents she planned to target. How many people did she send letters to? At least 47 that we can confirm. Some of the letters claimed to be from your HOA, others used the letterhead from Nelson and Associates, and a few even purported to be from the Maricopa County Clerk's office, threatening property liens. I felt sick. This is way bigger than I thought. Mrs. Hendricks is facing multiple felony charges: forgery, fraud, criminal impersonation, and harassment. The county attorney is also considering extortion charges for the letters that demanded specific payments. She's looking at serious prison time if convicted. Has she said anything? Like, why she did this? Detective Chen leaned back in her chair. According to her statement, she genuinely believed she was helping the neighborhood maintain standards. She felt the HOA board wasn't taking violations seriously enough, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. She thought if residents believed they were facing real legal consequences, they'd comply with the rules. That's insane. It's definitely criminal. The fact that she used letterhead from a real law firm makes it worse. She wasn't just pretending to be an authority. She was specifically impersonating licensed professionals and official entities. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the Pinehurst Meadows HOA was in chaos. The board had to hire a crisis management consultant to deal with the negative publicity. Property values were actually being affected because potential buyers were scared off by the news coverage. I attended the hearing along with about a dozen other residents who'd received the fake letters. Carol appeared with a public defender, looking nothing like the aggressive woman I'd encountered at the HOA office. She seemed diminished, almost fragile, wearing a plain gray suit and keeping her eyes down. The prosecutor, an assistant county attorney named Marcus Rivera, laid out the case methodically. He presented the fake letters, the forged letterheads, Carol's own admission that she'd created and sent them, and testimony from Wendy Nelson about the unauthorized use of her firm's name. Carol's public defender tried to argue that her actions, while misguided, weren't intended to defraud anyone for personal gain. My client genuinely believed she was acting in the HOA's best interest, the attorney said. She wasn't trying to steal money or damage property. She was attempting, albeit inappropriately, to enforce what she saw as community standards. Judge Patricia Morrison wasn't having it. "Counsel, your client forged letterhead from a licensed law firm and sent threatening letters demanding thousands of dollars from residents. Intent to help the neighborhood is not a defense to forgery, fraud, and criminal impersonation. These are serious crimes that undermine trust in legitimate legal processes." The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial and set a trial date for 2 months out. Carol was released on bail with conditions that she have no contact with any Pinehurst Meadows residents and stay at least 500 feet from the neighborhood. Wendy Nelson's Bar Association complaint was proceeding separately. Even though the investigation quickly determined that Wendy herself had done nothing wrong, the bar still had to examine whether there were any ethical violations in how she'd handled Carol as a client. I met with Wendy again a few weeks before the trial. She'd been cleared by the Bar Association, but the experience had clearly shaken her. "I keep wondering if I missed warning signs," she said. "Were there things Carol said or did during our consultations that should have tipped me off that she was going to do something like this? From what you've told me, you gave her accurate legal advice and specifically told her not to take unauthorized actions. You can't control what a client does after they leave your office. Intellectually, I know that. But this whole situation has made me much more cautious about who I take on as a client and what kind of advice I give. I've implemented new procedures at my firm for situations where a client seems to be misunderstanding or misapplying legal concepts." The trial itself was relatively quick. Carol's defense attorney had advised her to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a lighter sentence, but Carol refused. She apparently still believed she'd been in the right, or at least that she could convince a jury she'd been justified. That turned out to be a miscalculation. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The physical letters with forged letterheads, testimony from dozens of frightened residents, expert analysis of the documents showing they were deliberately designed to deceive, and the recording I'd made of Carol admitting to the scheme. The defense tried to paint Carol as an overzealous volunteer who'd made poor decisions but hadn't intended to commit crimes. They called character witnesses who testified that Carol had always been passionate about the neighborhood and maintaining property values. One witness, a neighbor who'd known Carol for years, even cried on the stand while describing how Carol had organized neighborhood watch programs and charity drives. But none of that could overcome the facts of what Carol had actually done. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 6 counts of forgery, 12 counts of fraud, 5 counts of criminal impersonation, and 3 counts of attempted extortion. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a month later. In the meantime, the civil lawsuits started rolling in. Multiple residents sued Carol for emotional distress, and Wendy Nelson's firm filed suit for damage to their professional reputation. The HOA itself also filed a lawsuit seeking to recover the costs of the investigation, legal fees, and damage to property values. I was subpoenaed for several of these civil cases. Sitting in depositions, I got to see just how much damage Carol's actions had caused. One elderly resident had suffered a minor stroke after receiving a letter threatening foreclosure. A young couple had lost a job opportunity because the background check turned up news articles about the fake letters linked to their address. A small business owner had seen his home-based consulting practice suffer because clients worried about his judgment after reading that he lived in the HOA scandal neighborhood. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Morrison allowed several victims to make impact statements. I was one of them. "Your Honor," I said, standing at the podium in the courtroom, When I bought my house in Pinehurst Meadows, I was looking forward to being part of a community. Instead, I found myself targeted by someone who believed her personal preferences were more important than actual rules and laws. The stress of receiving those letters, the time I've spent dealing with this situation, the damage to my peace of mind, it's all because one person decided she knew better than everyone else. I hope the court will send a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Others echoed similar sentiments. By the time the last victim had spoken, even Carol seemed to realize the magnitude of what she'd done. Her attorney made a brief plea for leniency, emphasizing Carol's lack of prior criminal record and her mental health struggles. Judge Morrison was unmoved. "Mrs. Hendricks, you violated the trust of your neighbors and abused a position of responsibility within your community. More troublingly, you impersonated legal professionals and official entities, which undermines public confidence in legitimate legal processes. Your actions were calculated, repeated, and caused substantial harm to numerous individuals." The judge sentenced Carol to 4 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to all of the victims, which the prosecution estimated would total over $200,000 when legal fees and damages were factored in. Carol's face crumpled as the sentence was read. Her attorney immediately filed notice of appeal, but legal experts I spoke with said the conviction and sentence would likely be upheld given the overwhelming evidence and the seriousness of the crimes. The civil lawsuits took longer to resolve. Carol had some assets: her house, retirement accounts, and a small investment portfolio. But it wasn't nearly enough to cover all the claims against her. Most of the victims eventually settled for whatever they could get, knowing that Carol would likely never be able to pay the full amounts awarded. Wendy Nelson's firm received a substantial settlement after Carol's homeowners insurance company agreed to cover part of the damage claim. The insurance company then turned around and sued Carol to recover what they'd paid out, adding yet another layer to the legal mess. The Pinehurst Meadows HOA went through a complete overhaul. David Chung and the rest of the board implemented new oversight procedures to prevent any single board member from having too much power. They hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations and violations processing. And they revised the CC and Articus to make them clearer and less open to interpretation. I got involved with the HOA board myself, accepting an appointment to fill Carol's vacant seat. It felt like the right thing to do, to help rebuild what she'd damaged. My first priority was working with the board to establish a residents' Bill of Rights, clearly outlining the process for violations, appeals, and ensuring that enforcement actions were always approved by the full board before being communicated to homeowners. About 6 months after Carol was sentenced, I ran into Gloria at the neighborhood grocery store. She'd retired from her position at the HOA office, deciding she'd had enough drama for one lifetime. "How are things going with the new management company?" she asked. "Much better," I told her. "Turns out when you follow actual procedures and treat residents like human beings instead of subjects to be controlled, an HOA can function pretty smoothly." "Who would have thought?" Gloria said with a smile. "You know, in all my years working with HOAs, Carol was the worst example of what happens when someone gets a little bit of power and lets it go to their head. I've seen petty people, sure, but Carol took it to a criminal level. You think she really believed she was helping the neighborhood?" Gloria considered this. "I think she started out genuinely wanting to maintain standards, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the community and became about her need to control things. When the board wouldn't let her have that control, she found another way to exert it. The Pinehurst Meadows community slowly recovered. The negative news coverage faded, property values rebounded, and life returned to a comfortable suburban routine. New neighbors moved in, often unaware of the scandal that had rocked the HOA just a couple of years earlier. I sometimes thought about Carol, sitting in state prison, probably still convinced she'd been right. The last I heard, her appeal had been denied, and she was serving her full sentence. Her ex-husband had divorced her shortly after the trial, and her adult children had reportedly cut off contact. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of accountability in any organization, even something as mundane as a homeowners association. The residents who'd been targeted by Carol's fake letters had learned to be vigilant, to question suspicious communications, and to insist on transparency from their elected representatives. As for Wendy Nelson, she'd become something of an expert on HOA law after the case. She'd written several articles for legal journals about the ethical considerations in representing HOA board members, and the importance of recognizing warning signs when clients might be planning to misuse legal advice. Her firm had actually grown, ironically benefiting from the name recognition that came from being involved in such a high-profile case. The fake letterhead that had started everything was now used as a training example at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, teaching deputies how to recognize forged documents and investigate fraud cases. Detective Chen had even given a presentation at a national law enforcement conference about the investigation, highlighting how community cooperation and quick action had helped build a solid case. One evening, about 2 years after the whole ordeal began, I was sitting on my back patio watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. My desert landscaping, the same xeriscaping that had triggered Carol's initial invalid violation, was thriving. The ocotillo was blooming, bright red flowers attracting hummingbirds. Frank, my neighbor, walked over with a couple of beers. "Beautiful evening," he said, handing me one. "Sure is. Hard to believe how crazy things were a couple years ago." "You did good, stepping up and getting involved with the board. Place runs a lot smoother now. We all learned some important lessons, like the difference between maintaining standards and being a tyrant," Frank laughed. "Carol never could figure that out. You know, I heard through the grapevine that she's up for parole review in about a year. Think she's learned her lesson? Doubt it. People like that rarely do, but at least she can't terrorize the neighborhood anymore." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken and the first stars appear. The community around us was peaceful, kids riding bikes, people walking dogs, the normal rhythms of suburban life. The HOA still existed, of course. There were still rules about trash cans and lawn maintenance and architectural modifications. But now there was balance, oversight, and an understanding that the rules served the community rather than the other way around. My phone buzzed with a text from David Chung reminding me about the next board meeting. The agenda looked routine: budget review, approval of new landscaping for the community entrance, discussion of the annual meeting schedule. Boring, bureaucratic stuff, exactly what an HOA should be handling. I texted back confirming I'd be there, then returned my attention to the sunset. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. I'd learned about forgery law, bar association procedures, and the criminal justice system. I'd learned about the importance of documentation and standing up against abuse of power. But most importantly, I'd learned that communities work best when everyone involved remembers they're dealing with neighbors, not subjects to be ruled. The fake letters that Carol had sent, forged with such care and malice, had ultimately accomplished the opposite of what she'd intended. Instead of intimidating residents into submission, they'd galvanized the community to demand better governance and accountability. Instead of establishing Carol's authority, they'd exposed her abuse of power and led to real reforms. As darkness settled over Pinehurst Meadows, lights began flickering on in houses across the neighborhood. Each one represented a family, individuals who'd chosen to live here and who deserved to feel safe in their homes. The HOA's job was to facilitate that sense of community and security, not to threaten it. I finished my beer and headed inside, already thinking about the proposals I wanted to bring to the next board meeting. There was talk of starting a neighborhood garden, organizing a community cleanup day, maybe even a summer block party. Positive things, community-building things, the kind of activities that made a neighborhood worth living in. The chapter of Carol Hendricks and her threatening letters on fake letterhead was closed. The legal system had worked, holding her accountable for her crimes. The Bar Association had protected the integrity of the legal profession by investigating and clearing Wendy Nelson. The HOA had reformed its procedures to prevent similar abuses in the future, and the residents had learned to be vigilant and demand transparency. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I just ignored that first fake letter, or if I hadn't been in the right place to overhear Carol's conversation with Wendy. Would Carol have continued escalating? Would someone have eventually given in to her demands, paying fines they didn't owe for violations they hadn't committed? But that was speculation about alternate histories. In reality, the truth had come out relatively quickly, and justice had been served. Carol was in prison. The victims were compensated as much as possible, and Pinehurst Meadows was moving forward as a healthier, better-governed community. As I settled in for the evening, I reflected on the strange journey that had started with a single piece of fraudulent mail. It had exposed corruption, tested the legal system, traumatized innocent people, and ultimately led to positive changes. The fake letterhead that Carol had so carefully crafted had become evidence in a criminal trial, a teaching tool for law enforcement, and a cautionary tale for HOAs everywhere. The story of Carol Hendricks would be told and retold in the neighborhood for years to come, a reminder of what happens when someone decides the rules don't apply to them. Parents would use it to teach their children about integrity and accountability. New board members would hear about it during their orientation, learning what not to do. Real estate agents would eventually stop mentioning it when showing houses in the area, but longtime residents would remember. For me, the experience had been transformative in unexpected ways. I'd come to Phoenix for a fresh start, a quiet place to focus on my environmental consulting work and enjoy the desert landscape. Instead, I'd been thrown into the middle of a criminal conspiracy and forced to become an advocate for my community. It hadn't been the peaceful suburban life I'd imagined, but it had been meaningful. And in the end, meaning matters more than peace. The fight against Carol's fraud had brought the neighborhood together, creating bonds between residents who might otherwise have remained strangers. We'd learned each other's names, shared our stories, supported one another through a difficult time. That sense of community, of belonging to something larger than ourselves, was worth all the stress and drama. The fake letters were gone, destroyed as evidence or locked away in court records. Carol was behind bars, paying for her crimes. Wendy Nelson was rebuilding her practice and helping other HOAs avoid similar problems. The residents of Pinehurst Meadows were living their lives, secure in the knowledge that their HOA was functioning properly, and that checks and balances were in place to prevent future abuses. And I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Home, in a community I'd helped protect and reform, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends, watching the Arizona stars emerge in the darkening sky. The journey had been unexpected and often unpleasant, but it had led me to a deeper connection with my community and a better understanding of the importance of standing up against injustice, even when that injustice comes from something as seemingly mundane as a homeowners association. The threatening letters on fake letterhead, the bar association complaint, the criminal trial, all of it was behind us now. Pinehurst Meadows had survived its scandal and emerged stronger. And that, ultimately, was the story worth telling, not just about how one person's abuse of power was exposed and punished, but about how a community came together to demand better and succeeded in creating real, lasting change. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, reforms had been implemented, and life had returned to normal. The fake letters that had threatened to tear the community apart had instead become the catalyst that brought us together and made us stronger. Sometimes, I thought, the worst crises create the best opportunities for growth and positive change. And somewhere in a state prison, Carol Hendricks was learning that lesson the hard way, one day at a time, serving her sentence for the crimes she'd committed in the name of neighborhood standards. The Bar Association had been notified, her victims had been heard, and the legal system had worked exactly as it should. The story of the threatening letters on fake letterhead had reached its conclusion, and Pinehurst Meadows was ready for whatever came next.